They told him to leave a hotel he owned. They called security on a man who built the building's foundation. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply made one phone call, and within minutes, the lobby would never be the same. You don't belong here. Get out. That sentence didn't just cut through the marble lobby of a 5-star hotel in Midtown Manhattan. It cut through something deeper. It cut through history, through memory, through a pattern I have seen repeated in far too many black stories to call it coincidence. It was 10:42 in the morning, 10 chandeliers overhead, polished glass, gold lettering, the kind of place designed to whisper exclusivity without ever raising its voice. And in the center of that luxury stood a black man in charcoal joggers, a fitted turtleneck, scuffed leather boots, and a single carry-on suitcase. No watch, no entourage, no visible wealth, just presence, and a general manager telling him to leave. I need you to stay with me on this. Because what happened in that lobby is not just a story about a hotel reservation gone wrong. It's a story about assumption, about perception, about the quiet violence of being told you don't belong before anyone has bothered to verify that you do. If you care about dignity, about power, about the way black stories unfold in spaces that were never designed with black presence in mind, you are in the right place. This is BG Stories, and today we are not just watching an incident. We are dissecting it. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel. Not because this is just another dramatic clip, but because these conversations matter. If you believe stories like this deserve depth instead of distortion, support the work. It gives this channel the fuel to keep exploring what most people only scroll past. Now let's go back to that lobby. The man standing there was Elijah Brooks. And here's what unsettled me from the very first second. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't say, "Do you know who I am?" He just looked at Gregory Madsen, the general manager, with a calm that felt almost surgical. I've spent years paying attention to black narratives in corporate spaces, luxury environments, boardrooms, airports, hotels. And there is a pattern I've learned to recognize. The moment a black person walks into a space, coded as elite without performing status, the room stiffens. Luxury spaces don't just sell comfort. They sell belonging. And belonging, in America, is often filtered through appearance. Elijah didn't look like what Gregory expected a penthouse guest to look like. That was the first trigger. You can't just walk in off the street and claim a penthouse. Notice the framing. Not, "Let me double check." Not, "There may be a system issue." It was an accusation dressed as procedure. And I want you to sit with something uncomfortable. Humiliation in America rarely announces itself as hatred. It hides behind policy, behind verification, behind protocol. Gregory called security before the system was properly checked. He raised his voice loud enough for the room to hear. He used the word fraudulent. Fraudulent. That word transforms a guest into a suspect. I remember the first time I watched footage of this incident, I didn't feel immediate outrage. I felt recognition. Because this wasn't loud racism. It was quiet profiling. The kind that slides in under the banner of, "We're just doing our job." And if you've followed enough black stories, you know that quiet profiling can escalate fast. What struck me even more than Gregory's tone was Elijah's restraint. At 27, he had been removed from a conference panel because security thought he was the tech crew. At 34, a luxury car showroom refused to unlock a vehicle he was there to purchase, suggesting he return with a real buyer. Now, at 42, in a hotel built on land his company helped finance, the narrative returned. Different building. Same script. And here's where I want to be very honest with you. If Elijah had walked in wearing a tailored designer coat, stepping out of a black SUV with a driver holding the door, would this have happened? Would Gregory have crossed his arms and projected authority? Or would he have smiled and said, "Welcome back, sir"? This is not about wealth. It's about who we assume wealth belongs to. Elijah didn't shrink. He didn't inflate. He didn't perform urgency to calm the room. He stood there like someone weighing silence against strategy. And that is what makes this story so compelling to me. Because when a black man refuses to respond with anger in a moment engineered to provoke it, something destabilizes. The aggressor expects reaction, expects heat, expects confirmation of a stereotype. Instead, Gregory got stillness. And stillness can be terrifying when you realize you might be wrong. As we move deeper into this story, I want you to pay attention not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. Not just to who had authority on paper, but to who carried real power in that room. Because within 20 minutes, the balance would flip in a way no one in that lobby anticipated. But that reversal didn't start with a shout. It started with a sentence. You don't belong here. The question we're going to unpack together is this. Who actually decides that? If the first blow was the sentence, you don't belong here, the second was quieter and in many ways more dangerous because it arrived disguised as procedure. What unfolded next in that lobby wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Gregory didn't explode. He recalibrated. His voice dropped into something cooler, more official. There seems to be an issue with your reservation. The phrasing was careful, neutral enough to defend later. But if you've paid attention to how power operates in spaces like this, you know that tone is everything. It wasn't curiosity. It was doubt dressed up as diligence. This is where escalation begins in so many black stories. Not with slurs, not with overt hostility, but with the slow tightening of scrutiny. Elijah handed over his ID, his card. No hesitation, no defensiveness. That detail matters. Because from this point on, every additional step Gregory took was no longer about missing information. It was about narrative control. I've watched enough incidents like this to recognize the pattern. The person in authority reframes suspicion as responsibility. I'm just doing my job. We have to verify. Policy requires. And here's the thing that unsettles me. Policy becomes elastic depending on who stands in front of the desk. Gregory typed slowly. Too slowly. He frowned in a way that felt rehearsed. Then he leaned slightly toward Heather, the junior staffer beside him, and whispered something that wasn't meant for Elijah to hear, but was meant to reinforce the script. Another penthouse claim. Another. As if this was part of a category. As if Elijah had been pre-sorted before the system had been properly checked. That word alone tells you that this was no longer about one reservation. It was about expectation. And expectation, when left unexamined, becomes bias in motion. I remember feeling a knot in my chest watching this sequence unfold, because I've seen this exact choreography play out in different environments. A black executive entering a boardroom and being mistaken for support staff. A black academic questioned twice as hard about credentials. A black homeowner asked to confirm ownership in their own neighborhood. The language is always polite. The implications are not. Gregory then motioned toward a low bench near the window. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we sort this out. Step aside. It sounds harmless. Reasonable even. But space inside a room communicates status. Who stands at the center? Who waits at the margins? Who is attended to immediately and who is asked to pause? When Elijah was directed to the side, it wasn't just logistical. It was symbolic. He was being repositioned from presumed guest to potential problem. And what struck me most was that Elijah didn't resist the motion physically. He didn't argue over the desk. He didn't lean in aggressively. Instead, he asked a question that shifted the energy in the room. You're certain you want to go this route? That wasn't a threat. It was a checkpoint. It was someone offering Gregory a moment to reconsider before escalation became irreversible. But ego rarely recognizes off-ramps. Gregory doubled down. He picked up the house phone. Security to the lobby. This is where escalation crosses from suspicion into spectacle. Calling security in a luxury hotel lobby is not neutral. It signals to everyone present that there is risk, that something is wrong, that someone does not belong. And the irony was thick enough to feel. Elijah had not raised his voice, had not refused to cooperate, had not created a disturbance, yet he was being framed as one. I want you to think about the psychological weight of that moment. To stand still, fully compliant, and watch yourself being recast as a threat. That kind of reframing is exhausting. And it happens in subtle ways every day in America. Marcus, the security officer, approached with professional posture. He didn't look angry. He looked procedural. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. Need. Another word that sounds neutral but carries authority. Elijah responded calmly. Is there a reason I'm being treated like a threat? That question cut through the choreography, because it named what everyone in the room could feel but hadn't articulated. Gregory tried to neutralize it immediately. No one said threat. We just need compliance. Compliance with what, though? With waiting while being doubted? With accepting that your legitimacy requires extra validation? This is where escalation becomes layered. It's no longer about the room. It's about the story being constructed in real time. Gregory raised his voice just enough for nearby guests to hear. You're holding up operations. There are real guests waiting. Real guests. Those two words did more damage than anything else he had said, because they implied Elijah was something else. Something provisional. Something suspicious. Something not fully entitled to the same treatment as everyone else in the lobby. And that's when the air shifted. You could feel it. People who had been quietly observing began to evaluate what they were witnessing. The woman near the elevator paused mid-step. The bellhop's tray wobbled slightly. A teenager lifted her phone. But here's what I find most revealing. Gregory didn't notice the shift immediately. He was too committed to the narrative he had already built. That's the danger of escalation. Once you commit publicly, retreat feels like weakness. So instead of recalibrating, you intensify. Fraudulent booking, he added. There it was again. The reclassification. From guest to suspect. And at this point, the system had still not been properly checked. The escalation was no longer about data. It was about control. I share this with you not as a detached observer, but as someone who has watched these dynamics repeat themselves across industries. The anatomy is consistent. Suspicion becomes delay, delay becomes isolation, isolation becomes public framing, and public framing invites enforcement. And what makes this particular story powerful is that Elijah did not accelerate the spiral. He didn't match volume with volume. He didn't overperform calm to prove innocence. He stood in it. And that choice, stillness instead of panic, began to expose the choreography for what it was. Not protection, projection. And it was in that projection, once fully exposed, that Elijah made a decision most people in that position would never make. He chose not to fight for the room. He chose to let the room reveal itself. There is a kind of power that shouts, and there is a kind of power that waits. What Elijah practiced in that lobby was the second kind. Not passive waiting. Not frozen silence. Strategic stillness. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that word, stillness, especially in the context of black men in public confrontation. Because America has trained itself to expect a certain script. The raised voice. The visible frustration. The see? I knew it, reaction that confirms bias rather than dismantles it. But Elijah didn't perform anger. And I need to be clear, the absence of anger is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of discipline. Standing there, hands resting lightly on the handle of his carry-on, he did not shrink. He did not puff himself up. He did not oversmile to soften the room. He simply stood centered, like someone who understood that time, not volume, was the decisive factor. That unsettles people more than confrontation ever could. When you expect resistance and receive composure, your own behavior becomes louder in contrast. Gregory's voice grew sharper. Rebecca's authority felt thinner. The security officer's posture shifted from certainty to hesitation. And Elijah remained still. I remember watching that moment and thinking, this is not a man trying to win an argument. This is a man assessing a pattern. Because what most people didn't know, what the room couldn't see, was that this wasn't Elijah's first time in this kind of choreography. At 19, he had been told he was too early in his career for a leadership program he met every qualification for. At 27, he had been mistaken for event staff at a conference he was scheduled to headline. At 34, he had been asked to return to a luxury showroom with a real buyer. Different cities, different buildings, same recalculation of his legitimacy. And here he was again, at 42, in a hotel tied to contracts his own company helped structure, watching suspicion bloom before verification. There's a concept psychologists call stereotype threat, the pressure someone feels when they know a stereotype about them is hovering in the air. That pressure can push a person to overcompensate, to smile more, to soften tone, to reassure aggressively in order not to confirm the assumption. Elijah did none of that. He didn't rush to perform respectability. He didn't say, I understand, sir, with exaggerated politeness. He didn't reach into his pocket to flash a business card like a shield. And that restraint is what makes this moment profound. Because when a black man refuses to perform reassurance, he forces the room to confront its own expectations. Think about that. If Elijah had raised his voice, Gregory would have pointed and said, there it is. If Elijah had pleaded, it would have reinforced hierarchy. If Elijah had over-explained, it would have validated the idea that extra explanation was required. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He let the silence stretch. Silence has weight. It presses against the edges of a room. It makes witnesses uncomfortable. It makes aggressors aware of their own volume. And that's when something subtle began to happen. Heather's eyes shifted. Darren's fingers hovered above the keyboard a second longer than before. The businessman near the concierge desk leaned forward, watching more closely. The teenager with the phone stopped pretending she wasn't recording. Stillness gave space for observation. If Elijah had reacted immediately, the narrative would have collapsed into noise. But by holding composure, he created a vacuum. And vacuums pull truth to the surface. There's something else that's important here, something I don't hear discussed enough when people talk about dignity in Black leadership stories. Composure is not submission. Elijah was not accepting mistreatment. He was cataloging it. You could see it in the way he asked questions instead of making accusations. Is there a reason I'm being treated like a threat? Not said with outrage, but with clarity. That kind of clarity disarms because it removes emotional distraction. He wasn't fighting Gregory. He was documenting Gregory. And that distinction matters. Because when confrontation becomes evidence instead of spectacle, the power dynamic shifts quietly but decisively. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if I would have had that level of composure in that moment. Most of us are wired to defend ourselves immediately when questioned publicly. The instinct to reclaim dignity through voice is strong. But Elijah chose to reclaim dignity through control. Control of posture. Control of tone. Control of timing. And in that control, something extraordinary happened. The narrative that had been building against him began to wobble under its own weight. Because the calmer he remained, the more exposed the escalation looked. That's the paradox of stillness. It feels inactive from the outside, but internally, it is calculation. And what I realized in that moment, what I want you to realize with me, is that Elijah wasn't waiting for permission to belong. He was waiting for the room to reveal who it believed belonged. And once that belief was fully visible, once it had spoken loudly enough to be undeniable, only then would he move. Not out of anger, out of precision. And once that belief was fully visible, something else began to surface, something Gregory and Rebecca never accounted for. The room was watching. Not casually, not passively, intently. There's a moment in public confrontations that I think is more important than the confrontation itself. It's the moment when bystanders stop assuming the person in authority must be right. It's subtle. It doesn't arrive with a sound, but you can feel it. The air shifts. The silence changes texture. At first, the lobby had operated like most public spaces do. People avoided eye contact. Conversations dipped, but didn't stop. No one wanted to insert themselves into something uncomfortable. That's human. We're wired to maintain social equilibrium. But Elijah's stillness did something powerful. It created time. And time allows people to evaluate. The woman near the grand piano was the first to break the quiet. She didn't shout. She cleared her throat. That tiny sound felt louder than Gregory's raised voice. I saw him hand over ID and a card. You never even checked the system. It wasn't just a defense of Elijah. It was a public questioning of authority. And that's when I realized this story had shifted from individual conflict to collective reflection. The businessman near the concierge desk added, "He hasn't done anything wrong." His tone wasn't dramatic. It was measured, observational. But in moments like this, observation becomes alignment. I want you to think about how hard that can be. To speak up when the person in charge appears confident. To challenge the narrative when the uniform, the badge, the job title all signal legitimacy. That's the bystander effect in real time. Most people wait. They look around to see if someone else will move first. No one wants to misread the situation. No one wants to escalate further. But once one voice enters, the silence cracks. The teenager who had been holding her phone discreetly stopped pretending. She lifted it fully. "I'm not putting this away," she said. "People need to see this." That line struck me. Because witnessing has evolved in the digital age. It's no longer just about standing physically present. It's about recording, preserving, archiving. It's about making sure moments like this can't be rewritten later. Gregory snapped that photography wasn't allowed. But it was too late. The narrative was no longer under his control. And here's what moved me most. Elijah didn't ask anyone to defend him. He didn't look around for allies. He didn't perform distress to elicit sympathy. He stayed centered. Which meant that when the crowd began to speak, it wasn't because he demanded it. It was because they recognized something was off. That distinction matters. Because when solidarity emerges organically, it carries more weight than when it's summoned. Darren, the junior staffer behind the desk, did something small but significant. He pulled up the internal guest log quietly. His fingers moved faster than before. When he found Elijah's name, confirmed, prepaid, corporate tier, he didn't announce it dramatically. He just said, "It's here." 2 words. It's here. In that moment, truth entered the room not as accusation, but as data. And data destabilizes bias. Heather's whisper followed shortly after. I shouldn't have stayed quiet. That confession hit me harder than the applause that would come later. Because so many people experienced that moment internally. The realization that silence, even when born from fear or uncertainty, still contributes to the imbalance. Elijah turned toward her, not with anger, but with something steadier. You didn't stay quiet. Not when it mattered. That line is leadership. He wasn't trying to create villains out of everyone present. He was distinguishing between escalation and awakening. And I think that's an important lesson in stories like this. Accountability doesn't require burning every bystander. It requires clarity about roles. The room, once hesitant, had become a mirror. It was reflecting back to Gregory and Rebecca what their behavior looked like from outside their own authority. You profiled him, the woman in pearls said plainly. The word hung in the air. Profiled. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatized. But it landed heavier than any insult could have. Because it named what had been circling unspoken. Authority can survive accusation. It struggles to survive articulation. As more phones lifted, as more eyes sharpened, the hierarchy inverted quietly. Gregory was no longer managing a guest. He was being evaluated by witnesses. And that is the moment when control begins to slip. What I find most revealing about this shift is that it didn't require Elijah to reveal his status. The crowd responded before they knew who he was. They defended behavior, not wealth. They aligned with composure, not power. That matters deeply to me, because it means the recognition of injustice did not depend on Elijah's title. It depended on observation. And when a room full of strangers starts to weigh behavior against principle, instead of deferring automatically to position, something rare happens. Authority becomes accountable. The lobby was no longer a backdrop for escalation. It had become a jury. And Elijah, still silent, still centered, allowed the room to reach its own verdict before he ever spoke his name. And once the room had reached its quiet verdict, Elijah finally decided it was time to move, not emotionally, but structurally. There is a difference between winning a moment and correcting a system. What happened next was not about pride. It was about architecture. When Elijah pulled out his phone and said, "Carla, begin Protocol 5, the words didn't carry volume. They carried authority. Not the kind Gregory had been projecting across the marble floor, but the kind that lives beneath the floor, embedded in contracts, compliance frameworks, back-end systems no guest ever sees. I remember the exact sensation I felt watching that moment unfold. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. Recognition that this was not a spontaneous reaction. This was preparation meeting opportunity. Carla's voice came through the speaker calm and precise. Internal trace active. Full system logging underway. Surveillance sync engaged. Guest witness proximity mapping compiling. Those phrases weren't theatrical. They were administrative. And that's what made them devastating. This wasn't a man raising his voice to demand respect. This was a founder activating oversight. Gregory blinked. Rebecca stiffened. Darren's screen flickered. A red banner appeared across the front desk terminal. Executive override. Brooks Enterprises compliance bridge active. In that instant, the room understood something that had been invisible until now. The authority Gregory had been wielding was operational. Elijah's authority was structural. And structural power does not need to argue. Here's what I find fascinating, and I want you to think about this with me. Elijah did not reveal his identity to rescue himself from embarrassment. He revealed it after the pattern was fully exposed. After witnesses had spoken. After the narrative of suspicion had been documented in real time. That sequencing matters. Because if he had announced, "I'm the CEO" at the first sign of doubt, the story would have collapsed into a status check. A misunderstanding corrected by hierarchy. Instead, he allowed the behavior to stand. Long enough to become evidence. That's not revenge. That's strategy. There is a temptation in stories like this to frame the reversal as triumphant. To celebrate the moment Gregory realized who he was dealing with. But I don't see triumph when I watch it. I see calibration. Elijah stepped behind the front desk slowly, not in aggression but in ownership. He placed his phone on the marble surface as if setting down a contract. "My name is Elijah Brooks," he said, "founder and CEO of Brooks Holdings Group." No raised voice. No flourish. Just fact. And then came the layer that reframed everything. Brooks Holdings maintained long-term management contracts over the Valiant. The compliance department reported upward. The digital architecture that ran the hotel's back-end systems flowed through his company's infrastructure. Gregory had been guarding a desk. Elijah had built the system. That difference is profound. I've spent a lot of time studying Black entrepreneurship and executive leadership, and one of the quiet realities is that Black ownership often remains invisible until crisis reveals it. Wealth and influence don't always announce themselves with spectacle. Sometimes they walk in wearing travel clothes and carry their own luggage. Rebecca tried to recalibrate. "If you had simply identified yourself." That sentence still unsettles me. If you had simply identified yourself. The implication is clear. Respect is conditional on status recognition. Elijah's response cut clean. "If I had worn a Rolex, arrived with a driver, or flashed a business card, would you have handed me the key?" No one answered. Because everyone knew the answer. And this is where the educational layer of this story becomes undeniable. The incident was never about access to a penthouse. It was about the assumptions that precede access. Protocol 5 continued to unfold. Carla's voice listed names. Gregory flagged for unauthorized profile override. Rebecca logged for verbal misconduct. Security audit initiated. The language was clinical. That's what made it powerful. Elijah didn't say, "You embarrassed me." He said, "You escalated a situation that never existed." There is discipline in that framing. He didn't personalize the misconduct. He categorized it. And I want you to see the distinction. When accountability is framed as personal offense, it can be dismissed as ego. When it is framed as procedural violation, it becomes undeniable. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about breach protocol. Darren turned his monitor toward Rebecca. The system confirmed Elijah's reservation had been flagged after Gregory accessed it, not before. In other words, the error was introduced by the person claiming to verify it. That revelation didn't require anger. It required clarity. Phones were still recording. The lobby was silent now, but not uncertain. The witnesses who had shifted earlier now watched with something closer to understanding. The power dynamic had inverted, but Elijah's demeanor had not changed. That consistency is what I admire most. He did not become louder once the advantage was his. He did not mock. He did not humiliate in return. He simply stated, "You touched my name, my reputation, and my property." 3 things. Name, reputation, property, all protected under systems he had built. And here's the part that lingers with me long after the applause that would come later. Elijah didn't say, "Now you see who I am." He said, "What doesn't matter is who I am now. It's who you thought I wasn't." That line reframes the entire incident from personal vindication to cultural critique. Because the mistake wasn't that they didn't recognize a CEO. The mistake was that they believed they could recognize one by sight. And that belief is far more dangerous than any single confrontation. Protocol 5 wasn't about spectacle. It was about documentation. It was about ensuring that behavior in that lobby did not dissolve into ambiguity later. Ownership activated oversight. And oversight demanded consequence. Not out of anger. Out of alignment. And once oversight had been activated, consequence was no longer a possibility. It was a process already in motion. What happened next is the part people tend to replay, screenshot, circulate. The digital chime. The screens going dark. The words, "access revoked," flashing across terminals that only minutes earlier had been used to question someone else's legitimacy. But I want us to move through this carefully, because this moment is not just satisfying, it's instructive. When Carla's voice confirmed that Gregory Madsen's credentials had been terminated and Rebecca Langston's building access would deactivate within minutes, there was no applause at first. Just silence. Thick, contemplative silence. Gregory's shoulders dropped before his words did. He reached for the keyboard instinctively, as if muscle memory could override authority. The system denied him. A red prompt. Access rejected. There's something almost poetic about that symmetry, but I resist framing it as poetic justice alone. This wasn't karma. It was compliance. And that distinction matters. I've seen too many stories where accountability gets reduced to spectacle. Someone is exposed, someone is humiliated, and the crowd feeds off the reversal. But this felt different. Because Elijah never changed his tone. He didn't savor the moment. He didn't say, "This is what you deserve." He said, "You made this public. The consequences will be public." That line stayed with me. We live in a culture that often protects authority in private while disciplining the vulnerable in public. Think about how many times mistakes at the top are handled quietly, behind closed doors, while mistakes at the bottom become cautionary tales. In that lobby, Gregory had no hesitation about raising his voice loud enough for guests to hear. Rebecca had no hesitation about framing Elijah as a disruption to the hotel's values. Humiliation was acceptable when it flowed downward. But when consequence flowed upward, suddenly there was a request for privacy. "Can we discuss this in private?" The irony was almost unbearable. Elijah's refusal wasn't cruel. It was consistent. If the initial escalation had unfolded under chandeliers and camera lenses, then the correction would stand under the same light. Consistency is integrity under pressure. Rebecca's voice trembled when she said she had worked there for 15 years. That line could easily invite sympathy. 15 years is not insignificant. It represents time invested, relationships built, routines formed. But tenure does not excuse harm. In fact, the longer someone holds authority, the more responsible they are for examining how they wield it. When Elijah responded, "Then 15 years taught you nothing about humility," it wasn't an insult. It was an assessment. Humility is not automatic with experience. It is intentional. It requires reflection, especially in environments shaped by hierarchy and perception. And here is where the moment deepened for me. Heather removed her name badge. Not because she had been ordered to. Not because her access had been revoked. She stepped out from behind the desk and said something that felt heavier than any termination notice. "Silence is consent. And I consented too long." That line pierced through the spectacle. Because while Gregory and Rebecca represented overt misuse of authority, Heather represented something quieter and more common: hesitation. How many of us have witnessed something that felt wrong and waited too long to speak? Not out of malice, but out of fear, uncertainty, deference to hierarchy? Elijah didn't condemn her. He didn't collapse her into the same category as those who escalated. He acknowledged the shift. You didn't stay quiet when it mattered. That response is leadership. It recognizes growth without ignoring responsibility. Darren, too, stepped forward, not dramatically, but with intention. He asked for transfer, not as escape, but as redirection. He wanted to learn, to understand, to operate differently moving forward. That matters, because accountability, when done correctly, does not destroy institutions. It reforms them. As compliance officers entered the lobby, black suits, earpieces, calm professionalism, the scene remained remarkably composed. There was no dragging, no shouting, no physical struggle. Gregory's anger flared briefly, but it dissolved under the weight of documented evidence. Rebecca walked slower, her posture no longer sharp, but subdued. The heels that had clicked confidently across marble minutes earlier now echoed differently. And still, Elijah did not gloat. That restraint is what separates discipline from dominance. He didn't frame this as personal victory. He framed it as systemic correction. The front desk sat still for a moment after the escorts exited with Gregory and Rebecca. Guests remained quiet. Phones lowered gradually. The energy in the room shifted from tension to something closer to clarity. Justice, when procedural, is rarely loud. It is methodical. It is clean. It leaves space for recalibration instead of chaos. And as I watched Elijah stand there, steady, composed, unshaken, I realized something. The most powerful part of this moment wasn't that he had the authority to fire them. It was that he exercised that authority without becoming what they had projected onto him. He did not meet ego with ego. He met misconduct with structure. And in doing so, he transformed what could have been a viral confrontation into a lesson in leadership. And after the structure had corrected itself, after the terminals went dark and the escorts disappeared through the revolving doors, what lingered in that lobby was not tension, but reflection. Elijah didn't stay to absorb admiration. He didn't stand beneath the chandeliers as if reclaiming a throne. He stepped away from the desk the same way he had approached it, without performance. He pressed the elevator button himself. That detail might seem small, but it stays with me. No assistant rushing in. No sudden entourage materializing. No exaggerated display of status now that it had been confirmed. Just a man, composed, letting the moment settle behind him. The doors opened. He stepped inside, alone. And in that quiet departure, I felt the weight of the story more than I had in any of the confrontation. Because the real message was never in the firing. It was in the restraint. I've thought a lot about belonging while reflecting on this story. Who gets questioned? Who gets waved through? Who has to prove? And who is presumed? Belonging in America has always been complicated for Black excellence. Even when ownership is real. Even when the contracts are signed. Even when the systems report upward to your name. There is still the test at the door. What struck me most is that Elijah never tried to convince anyone he belonged. He never argued for it. He never negotiated for it. He simply was. And that presence, that unshaken certainty, forced everyone else in the room to confront their own assumptions. Outside, the SUV waited. The driver opened the door. Elijah paused briefly, glancing up at the hotel's name etched in gold. Not to admire it, not to reclaim it, but almost as if measuring how much had shifted inside that building in less than an hour. He didn't need applause. He didn't need validation. Ownership doesn't need to announce itself. And here's the part that stays with me long after the footage ends. The crowd that had watched him walk in uncertain now watched him leave differently. Not because they learned he was wealthy, but because they witnessed how he handled power. That distinction matters. If this story were only about a CEO correcting a mistake, it wouldn't linger the way it does. What makes it resonate is the model it offers. Dignity without noise. Authority without cruelty. Correction without spectacle. As someone who chooses to explore Black stories intentionally, not as headlines, but as lessons, I keep coming back to one question. If Elijah had walked away quietly at the first insult, what would have changed? If he had erupted in anger, what would have been reinforced? Instead, he chose composure, documentation, and timing. And that choice did more than secure a penthouse suite. It exposed a pattern. So I want to leave you with this, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a real reflection. When you walk into a room and feel the temperature shift, when your legitimacy is quietly tested, when dignity is nudged instead of shattered, how do you respond? Do you shrink? Do you shout? Or do you stand long enough for the room to reveal itself? That, to me, is the real story. Not just who owned the building, but who owned themselves. What stays with me after everything settles, the confrontation, the reversal, the public accountability, is not the power shift itself. It's the composure. Elijah did not win because he was wealthy. He did not prevail because he had technological leverage. He prevailed because he never surrendered control of himself. In a moment designed to provoke, to belittle, to reduce him to reaction, he chose discipline over impulse. And that choice exposed more than bias. It exposed character on every side of the lobby. This story is not really about a penthouse. It's about perception. It's about how quickly assumptions harden into action when left unchecked. It's about how authority can become careless when it believes itself unquestioned. But more importantly, it's about how dignity, when anchored internally, does not need validation from the outside. Elijah didn't demand respect. He operated in alignment with who he already knew he was. And when the system corrected itself, it did so not because he shouted, but because he was prepared. The deeper lesson here is this. Composure is not weakness. Stillness is not surrender. Strategic patience can be more powerful than emotional retaliation. In your own life, whether in the workplace, in conflict, or in moments when you feel underestimated, the instinct may be to react immediately. But ask yourself, is this a moment for noise or a moment for precision? Is your goal to win the argument or to correct the pattern? Apply this by strengthening 3 things: awareness, preparation, and restraint. Know your value before you enter the room. Build systems, not just reactions. And when tested, respond in a way that protects both your dignity and your future. If stories like this challenge you, teach you, and make you think deeper about power and character, subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these conversations going and allows us to continue exploring stories that matter.